I want you to think about just the offset of having oyster reefs back for structure. 1 inch of oyster bed will offset 1 foot of storm surge. After Hurricane Michael, if you traveled 98, you could see areas that were more devastated than others. And those areas that had oysters or old reefs still available came out much better than those that did not. Just another little thing that the little oyster eco-engineer does. Well, next on the list to help us understand how these oysters built our coast, where we're at now, and what can be, is a fresh face to our division of aquaculture, the assistant director, Charlie Culpepper, who knows more about oysters and the environment than pretty much anybody I've met. And he does it in a way that's simple enough for even a guy like me can understand. So I'm excited for you to first understand how we got here and where we're going. Charlie?
Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here today. I promise I'm not as articulate as that trailer made me out to seem. They've done a great job with the film and editing. So Rob's tasked me with just basically giving you a history of oysters ecologically and from a commercial standpoint in about 3.5 minutes. So we better get started. So essentially when we talk about an oyster ecosystem, you have to ask yourself, what is a keystone species? You really can't look anywhere in the world for a better example of what a keystone species is than the oyster and the oyster reef. You can think about the Jenga tower here on the slide. You pull that bottom Jenga tower out and an entire ecosystem collapses. That's really how fundamentally important the ecosystem engineer, the oyster, is for the environment. You can just see in this graphic, the oysters themselves build the environment that allows literally hundreds of different species of marine organisms to shelter. All of our commercial and recreationally important fish, they grow up as juveniles in the oyster reefs. The oysters filter the water. It literally chemically purifies the water as well as cleans the turbidity out. So a clear water as opposed to turbid water allows seagrass meadows to thrive and all sorts of things like that. So from an ecological standpoint, they're really just the linchpin in the Gulf Coast system. So if we shift gears and we just talk about the cultural history of the oyster a little bit, you can see that this painting really sums it up. For literally about 20,000 years, the Native Americans lived and inhabited and thrived along the Gulf of Mexico's coastline. This is a pretty good image of what they would call a shell midden or shell mounds. The native peoples really lived exclusively off of the oyster, and they depended on it for food, for tools, for shelter, even for defense. Some of the naturalists that came in the early 19th century to the Gulf Coast basically said you couldn't go from 10,000 islands in southern Florida all the way to Pensacola without finding a shell mound 30 feet high every 100 yards. They were literally everywhere. So, and that culture really continued all the way up to when we can think about European expansion of the Gulf Coast. So this is a picture from 1885 at Apalachicola Bay. Oystering really started maybe around 1810 in the U.S. I put this picture of a can up here because it's kind of really interesting. You can't talk about the commercialization of oysters in the U.S. without thinking about when the tin can was invented. Making oysters and transporting them via cart, you're not going to be able to get very far before your product's really ruined and not safe. So when the tin can was invented, commercial oystering really picked up all around the United States because they could put it in a can, it could last a lot longer, and they could travel around. So in Florida, the first cannery for oysters was built. It was in Jacksonville in 1860. And Apalachicola really started to develop around 1850 and rapidly grew. The first cannery and really the next 30 to 40 years of history in Florida for oystering was really about infrastructure. Canneries were built all over the place. Packing facilities and the tonging industry really cranked up dramatically. You can just see some historic pictures here. It's a really impressive picture there on the left of a really big oyster from Apalachicola Bay. And down in the bottom, that's a photo from about 1920 of some of the canning and packing facilities in Apalachicola. So this is really a period of development and harvest. When you move into about 1913, the Florida Shellfish Division was created. So that's when a Marine Patrol essentially started regulating a little bit. You can see, and they also started really managing the resource. And that's when we move into the 20th century, we talk about oyster resource management, which is them sustainably harvesting and starting to think about this as not an unlimited food supply, but hey, we need to get shell and replenish the bay, and planting of bushels really continued for years all throughout Florida, and it still does today. So the next phase is really when we're going to be talking about the decline of the commercial oyster industry. So that's really happened all throughout the world, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But just for a graph of, you can look at commercial oyster harvesting data in Florida. The picture is pretty clear. Sustainable harvest and historic, really good data collection didn't start until about 1985 in Florida. But if you go back into historical records, harvest was really about the same all the way back to like 1900, 1910 when some information was available. So, and a decline really took place around 2010, 2013 in there, and that's happened really all around the world, but particularly in Florida and in Apalachicola Bay. So you can see the yellow, the top bar on here, that's Apalachicola Bay exclusively, or Franklin County, and then the entire rest of the state of Florida is here. So it has, and it really was about 30 to 40% of the oysters harvested in the entire state of Florida came from Apalachicola. So you can see that really shrank down to where we're at now, which is less than 5% of its historic level, even in the 1980s. So it's been a really precipitous collapse of commercial oyster harvesting. So why do we lose all of our oyster ecosystems? And so it's really about human stressors and environmental stressors. And if you want to sum it up, there's a huge amount of variables and answers depending on where you're at in the world. But it comes down to a changing environment and a growing global population and overharvesting. So about 85% of the oyster reefs around the world, and oysters do exist all around the world in every coastal ocean environment. So about 85% are gone, and some areas up to 99% of the oyster reefs are gone. In the Gulf of Mexico, it's probably around 85%, and that's really happened just over a few decades. So it comes back to salinity and increasing temperature. Salinity is the saltiness of the water, so changing, increasing freshwater usage for agriculture and human development has really changed the local ecosystems, and oysters have not been able to thrive like they once used to. It's a really delicate balance on the coastlines. It's also about dissolved oxygen, pollution, different diseases being transferred all around the world. So they've really been hit with just a huge amount of different hurdles, and it's really caused collapse. And like we said before, keystone species means when the oyster goes, an entire ecosystem goes at the same time. So we're all here today to talk about not really the bad news. This is a really positive future. There are really key tools that we can do to improve the environment and bring back the oyster ecosystem. This is not an impossible task. It's something that's happening right now. So we're going to be talking about aquaculture a lot today, and it really is one of the key solutions that we can have moving forward to bring back something that we really, everyone here I'm sure wants to see recover. You really can't find a better agriculture, really any kind of business industry than shellfish farming. I mean, it's an environmental and an economic win-win. With the collapse of the oyster environment, we also lost the collapse of a lot of jobs in economy and working waterfronts. So it's really just a win-win. I put, Rob has his make, not take. I think that's a really concise, nice way to put this. Aquaculture is a way to rebuild the environment, rebuild the economy, and add to the environment and not just take something out of it. So shellfish farming, this is my last slide just to finish up. They really are living water treatment plants. It's amazing what a single shellfish farm can do in a coastal environment. Just for some data, I'll switch over to aquaculture clams, the Cedar Key area. They have some data going back. So the clams that are farmed in Florida filter 550 million gallons of seawater every single day. Our oyster farms are going to be doing the same thing, especially as they grow and continue to expand. So a single oyster farm, it can remove the nitrogen pollution from 50 people that live along the coastline. And that's a 2.5 acre oyster farm. So that's a pretty impressive number. They're able to essentially suck up the nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus pollution that's coming in through our rivers and estuaries. So On top of that, they also provide that structure for habitat and enhanced recreational and commercial fisheries. So overall, it's just a really great, positive win-win for the environment. So, and I think Portia's up next. So, thank you.